In Turkey, a man repaired his basement wall and fell into a city for 20,000 people. Not a cellar, not a cave. 18 levels down, a forgotten city hid Byzantine Christians from Arab raids, then Mongols. He never knew he lived above a buried city until he broke the wrong wall. Today, 10 medieval underground cities built to hide entire communities. How many more lie buried beneath our feet? Let's go. Number 10. Derinkuyu. A man knelt in his own basement, patching a crack in the wall, when the wall gave way beneath his hammer and opened onto a passage that should not have been there. That moment, in 1963, is where most retellings of this place begin and end. But what that man actually found, once workers followed the passage down, was not a single hidden room. It was a city, folded into the rock beneath an entire ordinary Turkish town, and nobody living above it had the slightest idea it existed. Derinkuyu is carved into tuff, a soft volcanic stone laid down by eruptions long before anyone thought to live in this part of Cappadocia. Easy enough to cut with simple iron tools, yet strong enough to hold the weight of an entire hollowed hillside for well over 1,000 years. Byzantine Christians expanded it heavily between the 7th and 10th centuries, escaping wave after wave of Arab raids sweeping through Anatolia, and the digging never really stopped after that. Generations kept widening it further against Seljuk and later Mongol incursions, right through the heart of the medieval period, and small numbers of local families were still using parts of it as ordinary storage and shelter well into the early 20th century, long after anyone remembered exactly why it had first been dug. The scale, once surveyors finally mapped it properly, turned out to be almost absurd. The city drops roughly 85 meters straight down, at least 18 distinct levels stacked one below the other, and even now only around a tenth of that depth is open for anyone to walk through, the rest sealed off as unstable or simply never fully cleared. Estimates put its capacity at as many as 20,000 people at once, along with their livestock and enough stored grain, oil, and wine to last through a long siege above ground. Picture that number for a moment, an entire small city's worth of people, choosing to live crammed underground in the dark rather than risk what waited for them in the daylight. What makes Derinkuyu stranger still is how it was entered. Archaeologists have identified more than 600 separate tunnel entrances scattered across the surface above, and a striking number of them sit directly beneath the basements and courtyards of ordinary private houses, exactly like the one that cracked open in 1963. Families built their homes for generations directly on top of hidden doorways into another world, using the ground floor as an ordinary house while a few careless hammer strikes away, an entire second civilization slept in the dark beneath their kitchen tables. Walk the levels that are open today, and the layout still reads as a fully functioning town rather than a mere hiding hole. Wine presses and olive presses sit carved directly into the stone floors, worn smooth by generations of use. Stables line certain corridors, still holding the faint impression of where animals were tethered for months at a time. Storage rooms, communal kitchens, and refectories for shared meals sit beside small chapels cut straight into the rock, so an entire underground population could eat, work, and pray without ever needing the surface. Heavy circular stone doors, cut to fit their doorways exactly like millstones, could be rolled shut from the inside to seal off an entire level in seconds, turning a narrow corridor into a dead end the moment danger came too close. None of that could have worked without air, and this is where the engineering turns almost impossible to believe for people cutting rock by hand. Ventilation shafts run the full 85 meters from the deepest chamber to the open sky above, narrow enough to stay nearly invisible from the surface, yet wide enough to keep breathable air moving to every level below during a siege that might last for months. A candle lit at the bottom of one of those shafts today will still visibly flicker from air moving through solid rock that has not been touched in centuries. 10 kilometers away, connected by a tunnel long enough to walk for hours underground without ever surfacing, sits another hollowed city that grew every bit as large. That connection is not a minor detail. It means Derinkuyu was never an isolated hiding place scattered at random beneath one unlucky hillside. It was one node in something closer to a hidden regional network, cities linked to cities, so that an entire threatened population could move from refuge to refuge without a single person ever stepping into open daylight. Even Derinkuyu could not outlast the century that finally emptied it. The Christian families who had kept using the upper chambers for storage and shelter, generation after generation, were forced out of the region entirely in 1923, when a population exchange between Greece and Turkey uprooted communities that had lived there for centuries and resettled them on opposite sides of a new border. The town above fell quiet almost overnight, and the tunnels beneath it sat sealed and unvisited for the next 4 decades, waiting in total silence for a single misplaced hammer blow to bring them back into the light. The detail that lingers longest, though, is simpler than any of the numbers. For centuries, ordinary families lived their entire lives directly above a buried metropolis built to hold 20,000 strangers, raising children, cooking meals, and sleeping soundly, with absolutely no way of knowing how much silence and stone was stacked 18 levels beneath their floor. It took one broken wall in one ordinary house to finally prove that the ground itself had been hiding something all along. Number 9. Kaymakli. 10 kilometers from the underground city already behind us, a tunnel stretches 8 kilometers through solid rock and arrives at another hidden world, carved into the pale volcanic stone of central Cappadocia. The rock here is tough, laid down by ancient eruptions long before any human hand touched it, soft enough to work with simple iron tools, yet strong enough to hold a roof over thousands of heads for more than 1,000 years. Christians widened Kaymakli in the 4th century, during the era of Roman persecution, cutting deeper into passages that earlier peoples may have started centuries before. What began as a shelter of desperation kept being used, generation after generation, through the Arab raids that swept across Anatolia in the centuries that followed, and then through the Turkish invasions that reshaped the region, right into the heart of the medieval period. Walk down through its narrow passages today, and the air changes almost immediately. It turns cool, mineral, faintly damp, the kind of stillness that swallows sound within a few steps of the entrance. The city drops roughly 40 meters below the surface, spread across something like 8 levels, though only 4 of them are open to visitors now, the rest sealed off, unexcavated, or judged too unstable to walk through safely. Kaymakli was never the deepest of the Cappadocian shelters. Other sites nearby plunge far further into the rock, but it was the widest, spreading out sideways rather than down, corridor branching into corridor until the whole hillside became a honeycomb. And estimates suggest that at its fullest it held somewhere between 3,500 and 6,000 people at once, an entire hidden population roughly the size of a small modern town, breathing, eating, and praying under a hill that, from the surface, looked like nothing more than ordinary farmland. That 8-kilometer tunnel connecting Kaymakli to the city already behind us is not a curiosity. It is a reminder that these were never isolated hideouts scattered at random across the landscape. They were nodes in something closer to an underground highway system, one hollow settlement linked to the next by passages long enough to walk for hours without ever surfacing, so that an entire regional population under threat could, in theory, move from one refuge to another without a single person stepping into open daylight. Archaeologists still are not certain how many such connections exist beneath this stretch of Cappadocia, since most of the linking tunnels remain unmapped, collapsed, or simply too dangerous to explore fully, meaning the true size of this hidden network below the surface may still be far larger than anything counted so far. None of that population could have survived without air, and this is where the engineering becomes almost impossible to believe for a structure with no modern tools behind it. Ventilation shafts plunge 80 meters straight down through the rock, narrow enough to be nearly invisible from above, engineered so that a hidden city could keep breathing for as long as the danger overhead took to pass. Consider what that meant in practice. A child born underground during a siege might spend the earliest months of life never once seeing daylight, fed and kept alive entirely on air pulled down through a shaft no wider than a well, lit only by the flicker of oil lamps that themselves competed for that same thin supply of oxygen. The layout below followed logic, not chaos. The first level held stables, animals led down into the dark alongside their owners, the smell of livestock mixing with damp stone and lamp smoke. The third level was devoted to storage, wine presses, oil presses, kitchens whose ceilings are still stained black with centuries of soot from cooking fires that had nowhere to vent except upward through the same shafts carrying air to the rooms above. Above that lived the wealthier families, in chambers set apart from churches and schoolrooms cut straight into the rock, so that an entire community, not merely a hiding band of refugees, could keep functioning underground for months without needing the surface at all. Heavy circular stones, cut to fit their doorways like millstones, could be rolled across certain corridors from the inside, sealing off a level from anyone who managed to force their way in from above, a defense that turned narrow hallways into dead ends the moment the wrong footsteps were heard approaching. The Christian families living above kept using the space for storing crops and sheltering animals for generations, right up until 1923, when the population exchange between Greece and Turkey forced them out of the region entirely and emptied the town above almost overnight. The tunnels beneath sat quiet for decades after that, before finally being reopened for tourists in 1964. The detail that lingers longest is simpler than any of the numbers. Ordinary houses in the town above sat, for centuries, directly on the roof of a city built to hold thousands of strangers beneath their floors, families going about their daily lives, drawing water, tending goats, raising children, with no way of knowing exactly how much lay hollowed out under their feet. And inside that hollow world, distinct quarters for the wealthy and the poor are still traceable today, an entire buried society, quietly mirroring the same order of the one breathing in open air just above it. How many generations of villagers walked over that ceiling, never once wondering what was underneath? How many children who once lived down in the dark, hearing nothing but dripping stone and murmured prayers for weeks at a time, grew old never speaking of it once the danger had passed, the whole experience folded away into silence rather than memory. The next city on this list was not found through careful excavation or through any deliberate search at all. It was found because water kept disappearing from the fields of a local farmer, and for a long time nobody could explain why. Number 8. Ozkonak. Also carved into the volcanic rock of Cappadocia, Ozkonak is thought to have been cut deeper into the stone by Byzantine residents of the region, most likely during the long centuries when this frontier sat exposed to raiding armies moving back and forth across Anatolia. From roughly the 7th century onward, Arab forces pushed repeatedly into Byzantine territory, and communities living in the shadow of that danger dug downward rather than building upward, trading visible walls and watchtowers for invisible depth that no approaching army could see from a distance. Ozkonak was used heavily as a defensive refuge through the medieval centuries that followed that same long conflict, one more layer added onto a landscape already honeycombed with hidden shelters, each village quietly building its own escape route into the rock beneath the fields it worked every day. Nobody above ground found it until 1972. A local farmer named Latif Akar noticed something wrong with his own irrigation water. Every time he flooded his fields, the water kept vanishing into the ground faster than it should have, soaking away as though the earth itself were swallowing it whole. Rather than dismiss it as a simple drainage problem, he started digging to find where it went. What he uncovered was not a broken pipe or an ordinary sinkhole. It was the entrance to an entire hidden city that had sat beneath his crops, undisturbed, for the better part of 1,000 years, waiting under the exact soil he had walked across every season without ever suspecting what lay beneath it. News of the discovery spread quickly through the surrounding villages, and for a while the whole community had to reckon with an uncomfortable question. How many other fields nearby might be sitting on similar hollow ground, unnoticed for the same reason, simply because nobody had ever had a reason to dig deep enough to find out? 10 levels dropped away beneath that field, reaching roughly 40 meters down into the rock. Estimates of how many people it could hold vary depending on the source, but some accounts suggest it could shelter a striking number of people for as long as 3 months without a single person needing to step outside into daylight. Living that long in the dark meant more than simply hiding. It meant an entire underground routine, sleeping in shifts, eating whatever stores had been carried down in advance, tending whatever little livestock could be brought below, all timed to a rhythm that had nothing to do with the rising or setting of the sun. The city even had its own internal communication system, primitive speaking tubes cut directly through the rock, so that a warning shouted from the deepest chamber could travel upward through solid stone toward the levels nearer the surface, faster than any messenger could run the same distance on foot through a maze of identical dark corridors. To picture that scale in modern terms, imagine an entire small town choosing without hesitation to abandon sunlight completely for a full season rather than risk what waited above ground, trusting stored grain, cellar wine, and a system of hand-dug air shafts to keep an entire community alive through the length of a season. Most people today would consider unbearable to spend indoors, let alone underground in the dark. That was the baseline expectation this shelter was built around. Not an emergency measure for a single desperate night, but a fully engineered way of disappearing for months at a time, whenever the alternative above ground grew too dangerous to risk. What set Ozkonak apart from its neighbors, though, was not comfort or capacity. It was cruelty, engineered directly into the architecture itself. Narrow holes were punched straight through the ceilings of certain corridors, positioned exactly where an advancing enemy would have no choice but to pass beneath them in single file, unable to see what waited above. Defenders standing on the level above could pour boiling oil down through those same holes onto anyone forcing their way through the passage below, turning a hallway into a trap in the space of a few seconds, with no room to run and nowhere to shield against what fell from the dark. Other openings existed for no purpose, except to drop scorching hot sand onto attackers already trapped in a tunnel too narrow to retreat through quickly, a burning weight that would work its way into armor and skin alike, far more agonizing and far harder to escape than a simple blade. Historians say this particular defense is not matched at other underground sites in the region, a design built by people who understood exactly how a corridor could be turned into a killing floor without a single soldier ever needing to draw a weapon. Those holes are still visible in the tunnel ceilings today, small dark openings that once turned an ordinary passage into a floor no invading soldier wanted to cross twice. Standing beneath one now, it is worth asking how many men climbed into that tunnel expecting only more darkness ahead, never realizing that the ceiling above them had been built specifically for the moment they arrived, and how many turned back the instant they understood what those holes were for. But the more unsettling part of the whole story may simply be how long the place stayed lost. An entire fortress built to kill silently sat forgotten under a working farm for centuries, its violent purpose completely erased from memory, discovered in the end not by soldiers or scholars, but because one farmer could not explain where his water kept going. What finally brought it back into the light was not conquest or curiosity, but something as mundane as irrigation, a detail almost comic against the sheer violence of what that irrigation eventually revealed. The next site on this list was not built only as a hiding place. It grew, over time, into a cave monastery large enough to be its own city, until the day an earthquake tore the mountain open and showed the world exactly what had been hidden inside it all along. Number 7. Vardzia. High in the Irasheti Mountains of Georgia, cut into cliffs rising above the Mtkavari River, Vardzia began as the vision of King Georgi III in the 12th century. At a moment when the Georgian kingdom stood as one of the great Christian powers of the region, wealthy, confident, and surrounded on nearly every side by rival empires pressing against its borders. His daughter, Queen Tamar, took that vision and expanded it dramatically at the end of that century and into the start of the next, during what is still remembered as the high point of medieval Georgian power, an age of cathedrals, trade routes, and military confidence that Vardzia itself was meant to help protect. It functioned as a spiritual fortress on the eastern edge of the Christian world, a place meant to keep faith and people alike safe from invasion, including Mongol incursions that swept through the wider region in the centuries that followed, all the way through the closing centuries of the medieval period. By the early 13th century, the complex had grown to 13 levels and held more than 6,000 rooms, a hollowed mountain roughly equivalent in scale to an entire modern apartment district, except carved entirely from solid rock rather than built up from a foundation. Every corridor and chamber cut by hand out of stone that had stood unmoved for millions of years before anyone thought to hollow it out. Wine cellars ran deep into the stone alongside stables, a bakery, an apothecary, even a library, everything a self-sufficient community would need to survive without ever descending to the exposed valley floor below, where an approaching army could otherwise have watched every movement in the open. At its peak, as many as 2,000 monks are said to have lived inside the mountain, a population close to that of a small medieval town, praying in carved chapels lit only by candles, copying manuscripts letter by letter in rooms with no natural light of their own, tending vines on narrow terraces cut into the slope outside, all inside a stone honeycomb engineered to stay unseen from anyone traveling along the river beneath it. To grasp what that population meant in practice, picture the entire working population of a small medieval town, not soldiers, not nobility, but scribes, vintners, bakers, and healers, choosing a life inside solid rock over a life in the open valley below, trading windows for candlelight and open fields for narrow terraces cut into a cliff face, purely because it kept them beyond the reach of armies that could otherwise burn a valley settlement to the ground in an afternoon. For roughly a century, that trade seemed to work exactly as intended. Under Queen Tamar, Georgia had reached a level of wealth and cultural confidence that later generations would look back on as something close to a golden age, and Vardzia was as much a statement of that confidence as it was a hiding place, a monument that said the kingdom could carve an entire second capital of faith straight into a mountainside, and still keep it concealed from the world below, an achievement that would have been almost impossible to imagine from the valley floor, where nothing about the cliff face hinted at the scale of what had been hollowed out behind it. Then, in 1283, the ground itself intervened. A massive earthquake tore through the region and destroyed roughly 2/3 of the complex in what can only have been a matter of moments, tearing away a huge slab of the mountainside and taking entire levels of carved rooms down into the valley with it. What had been engineered, patiently, over generations, to remain completely invisible was suddenly and violently exposed to anyone simply looking up from the river below. Thousands of carved rooms lay bare across the cliff face like a broken honeycomb split open under a knife, visible for miles in every direction where once there had been nothing but plain, unremarkable rock. Imagine waking inside a mountain built specifically to disappear, and finding, within the span of a single night, that the wall separating your cell from the open sky had simply vanished, leaving monks who had spent their whole lives in candle-lit privacy suddenly staring out at empty air and a long fall to the river. Those who survived the collapse had no choice but to keep living in what remained, praying in chapels that had lost an entire wall to open sky, rebuilding a portion of daily life inside a monastery that the rest of the valley could now watch from a distance for the first time in its history. Today, more than 400 rooms still survive, along with 13 churches and 25 wine cellars cut into the stone, a fraction of what once existed but still enough to walk through and sense the scale of what had been lost in that single event. The detail that stays longest is not any single number from before the disaster. It is the moment itself, a single earthquake stripping away the face of an entire mountain and turning a city that had been built specifically to disappear into a wound in the rock that could be seen from a great distance, in the space of one violent night, undoing centuries of careful concealment before dawn had even broken. What does it mean to build something for generations with the entire purpose of never being seen, only to have it revealed all at once, completely, permanently, and beyond any hope of ever hiding it again? A refuge is only as good as its secrecy, and here an entire mountain learned, in a single violent night, that even stone has limits to what it can keep hidden forever. Georgia holds one more entry on this list, and its story runs in the opposite direction of everything just described. Rather than beginning in secrecy and ending in exposure, this next place started as the beating political heart of an entire kingdom, in plain sight of everyone, only to end its life as little more than a hole to hide in. Number 6. Uplistsikhe. Climb the dry riverbank above the Mtkavari near the city of Gori, in the Georgian region of Shida Kartli, and the hillside stops looking like a hillside. Window openings stare out of bare rock in even rows. Staircases climb straight up the cliff face with no building around them, because the building is the cliff. Uplistsikhe is one of the oldest cave settlements in the entire country, and long before anyone called this land medieval, it was already the political and religious heart of pre-Christian Kartli, a capital carved rather than built, standing where trade routes between the Black Sea coast and the lands further east cross through the mountains. That is the part easy to picture from a distance. Harder to picture is what it took to make it. Every hall, every temple chamber, every narrow passage connecting one level of the city to another was chiseled by hand out of solid stone, one strike at a time, across generations who never expected to see the finished result in their own lifetime. Sons continued what fathers started. Whole neighborhoods of rooms grew outward from older rooms the way a tree adds rings, and the work never really stopped. It kept going straight through the medieval centuries, into the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, long after most people would assume a settlement this old had already reached its final shape. Pagan shrines from the earliest era sat alongside Christian chapels added centuries later, and rock-cutting habits that clearly traveled in from Anatolia blended with cave-building traditions carried over from Iran. Nobody was executing a single master plan. Generation after generation simply added whatever the moment required, and the result was a city stitched together out of different worlds, layered into the same rock like sediment. Walk through what remains, and the layout still reads like a functioning town frozen mid-motion. There is a hall large enough to gather a crowd for a ceremony, its ceiling still bearing the marks of the tools that hollowed it out. There are storage pits sunk into the floor for keeping grain through the winter, and channels cut along the rock to carry rainwater down towards cisterns instead of letting it pool and rot the stone from within. Whoever planned these spaces was not simply hiding from weather or enemies. They were running an entire settlement with its own workshops, its own gathering halls, its own quiet corners for prayer, and doing all of it inside a mountain rather than on top of one. For a visitor today, the scale barely registers as unusual, since caves feel small and personal. Only after noticing how far the passages run, how many chambers connect to how many other chambers, does it become clear this was never a shelter. It was a working capital wearing the shape of a cliff. Then, fairly abruptly for a place with such a long and gradual history, the ground shifted under it. After Tbilisi fell in 1122 and became the seat of a newly unified Georgian kingdom, the old cave capital found itself on the losing end of a very ordinary kind of history. Power was moving toward open cities built for administration and trade, not toward fortified stone honeycombs carved into a riverside cliff. Uplistsikhe began losing its importance almost overnight, stripped of the role it had spent centuries earning. It was still standing, still full of temples and halls, but it was no longer where decisions were made. The real blow came later in the 13th century, when the Mongol invasion tore through the wider region and devastated large parts of the city. Picture the wooden roofs above the stone chambers catching fire, smoke pouring out of window openings that had once looked out over a thriving capital, families fleeing down staircases their ancestors had carved. Uplistsikhe never recovered from that. It was not rebuilt. It was not resettled. In the centuries that followed, local people ducked into its hollow halls only occasionally, using them as a temporary shelter, whenever a new wave of invasion swept through the valley below, before the whole site was abandoned for good and left to the wind. Sit with that reversal for a moment. A place that once functioned as one of the central political and spiritual hubs of an entire kingdom, a city where priests once conducted rites and rulers once held court, ended its working life as nothing more than an emergency hole in the rock, the place villagers scrambled toward whenever soldiers appeared on the horizon. A capital does not always fall in one dramatic collapse with a single burning night that historians can point to forever after. Sometimes it just quietly stops functioning as a city and slides, chamber by empty chamber, into becoming a hiding place instead, until nobody left alive remembers it as anything else. Think about what that shift would have felt like from the inside, generation after generation, rather than as a single event. The grandchildren of people who once walked past working temples and busy storerooms would have grown up knowing this place only as somewhere to run to, not somewhere to live. Did those later villagers, crouched in the dark with their children during another raid, have any sense that they were huddled in what had once been a throne room or a shrine hall for an entire kingdom? Or had that memory already been erased along with everything else the invasions took? A capital with no population left to remember being a capital is not really a ruin in the usual sense. It is a city that outlived its own history and kept standing anyway, silent about everything it used to be. The next entry on this list hid something entirely different underground. Not soldiers ducking from an army and not priests guarding a shrine, but an entire people who were simply forbidden from living anywhere else. Number 5. Chufut Kale. High in the Crimean mountains near Bakhchisarai, a plateau drops away on almost every side into sheer cliff, and along its edge, a fortress city was carved directly into the exposed rock. From below, the site looks less like a settlement, and more like the mountain itself had been hollowed out and fitted with doorways. Its story, though, begins long before its most famous residents ever set foot there. The earliest phase was a fortified Byzantine settlement dating back to the 5th and 6th centuries, built to watch over the surrounding valleys and step from a position nothing short of an army could easily reach. Written sources mention the site by the name Kiakor, meaning 40 fortifications, in documents from around 1253 to 1254, a name that already hints at how seriously its defenses were regarded. By the 15th century, the plateau fortress had become the residence of Hasai I Jure, the first Khan of Crimea, a ruler who needed exactly the kind of position this rock offered, a stronghold that could double as both a home and a last line of defense. The name Chufut Kale itself translates from Crimean Tatar and Turkish as Jewish fortress, and that name points directly toward what happened next inside those walls. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453 sent shockwaves through the region and scattered communities across new borders, the Crimean Karaites, a Turkic-speaking Jewish community with its own distinct traditions, resettled here in large numbers, building a life for themselves on a plateau most people would only ever glimpse from the valley floor. By the middle of the 17th century, the Tatar population had abandoned the city entirely, moving down toward more convenient towns below. Only the Karaites remained behind on the exposed rock, and staying there was not entirely their choice. The laws of the Khanate restricted where they were permitted to settle, closing off most other towns to them, and leaving this fortress as one of the few places they were legally allowed to call home. Picture what daily life must have looked like up there across those centuries. Water hauled up from cisterns, homes built snugly against stone that had been quarried out of the very ground beneath them, children growing up learning the exact paths along the cliff edge that would not send them tumbling into the valley below. Streets were narrow because the plateau itself was narrow, houses pressed close against each other and against the bare rock, and every structure had to answer to the same unforgiving geography. There was no room to sprawl outward the way an ordinary town might, so the settlement grew dense instead. Workshops and homes and places of worship all within a short walk of one another, hemmed in on every side by open air and a long drop. 2 Karaite prayer houses still stand on the site today, and the larger of the two is traditionally dated to the 14th century, a building that watched generations arrive, marry, raise families, and die within sight of the same cliff edge. For hundreds of years, an entire religious and cultural community organized its whole existence around a plateau it was never free to leave, turning enforced isolation into something resembling ordinary, functioning life, because that was the only option available to them. Then everything changed at once. After Russia annexed Crimea in 1783, the old restrictions on where the Karaites could live were finally lifted, and the legal wall that had confined them to this rock for generations simply stopped existing. Given genuine freedom to settle wherever they wished for the first time in living memory, the population did not stay behind to enjoy that freedom in the place that had sheltered them. They left, steadily and then completely, choosing ordinary towns down in the valley over the fortress their ancestors had called home. By the middle of the 19th century, the city that had once housed a thriving community was completely empty, its prayer houses standing silent above a plateau with nobody left to climb it. The detail worth sitting with is the exact shape of that abandonment, because it runs backward from what people usually expect. An entire community lived for generations inside a cave city carved into these cliffs, and did so not out of tradition, not out of faith, not because the site held any particular spiritual meaning for them, but simply because the law of the land below would not let them live anywhere else. The moment that law lifted, the fortress that had sheltered them for centuries emptied out within decades, as if the walls themselves had never meant safety at all, only confinement dressed up as a home. A place can hold a people for hundreds of years and still never once have been theirs by choice. Ask what that means for how a home gets defined. Most fortress towns in this period were built by the people who lived in them, walls raised to keep danger out and everything valuable safely in. Here the walls served the opposite function for the community trapped behind them, keeping a population contained more than it ever kept anyone out. Would the descendants who finally walked away in the middle of the 19th century have described those empty prayer houses as home, or simply as the place their family happened to survive in until the law finally let them go? Freedom, when it finally arrived, did not make anyone want to stay and enjoy it. It only made the plateau feel like exactly what it had quietly been all along, a beautiful, defensible, and thoroughly involuntary address. Whatever came next on this list was not built to imprison a people. It was built to feed one. The next underground city hid not persecuted families, but a secret farm designed to keep a besieged town alive for months. Number 4. Orvieto. Beneath the town of Orvieto, perched on its volcanic tuff plateau in the Italian region of Umbria, the ground itself is hollow. Walk the streets above and nothing looks unusual. Ordinary stone buildings, ordinary piazzas, the kind of quiet Umbrian townscape that has drawn visitors for centuries. Step down through an unmarked door in the right cellar, though, and the town opens into something else entirely, a honeycomb of tunnels, chambers, and shafts running beneath almost every building above. The earliest tunnels and wells were cut by the Etruscan centuries before the Middle Ages even began, carving into the soft volcanic rock, because it was far easier to dig into than to quarry and haul from elsewhere. But the network truly exploded in size during the medieval period, expanding exactly when Orvieto climbed to the height of its political power and needed every resource that hidden ground could offer. A speleological survey carried out in the 1960s mapped roughly 1,200 underground cavities clustered beneath the town's main square alone, a number that turns a quaint hilltop town into something closer to a city built twice, once above the ground and once beneath it. The medieval additions to that network include wells sunk deep enough to guarantee water even under siege, cisterns for storing what fell as rain, grottos carved out for storage, galleries connecting one household's private tunnels to another, shelters meant purely for hiding people and valuables, quarries where usable stone was cut straight out of the walls, and cellars for keeping food cool through the hot Umbrian summers. None of it followed any single overall plan. It was dug piecemeal, family by family and generation by generation, layered on top of earlier digging, and stitched together afterward by a tangled web of connecting passages that nobody above ground could have mapped from memory even at the time. Some of those chambers were fitted out as kilns for firing ceramics, the heat and smoke safely contained underground rather than filling the streets above. Others became olive presses, complete with millstones and stone troughs worn smooth by the animals that spent their working lives turning them round and round in the dark, converting the harvest into oil one slow circuit at a time. Imagine working down there day after day, the air thick with dust and the smell of crushed olives, lantern light, the only thing separating a laborer from total blackness. The whole operation running quietly beneath neighbors who had no idea an oil press was grinding away under their own feet. Then there are the dovecotes, which might be the strangest surprise of the entire network. Cut directly into the rock walls of certain chambers, rows of small identical niches once held pigeons by the hundreds, and pigeons were nothing like the pests they are treated as today. They were a serious strategic asset. A breeding pair of pigeons can raise a new generation in just a matter of weeks, which meant a besieged town with its own hidden pigeon farm buried underground had a renewable, self-replacing source of meat that no enemy camped outside the walls could ever cut off, starve out, or seize, no matter how long the siege dragged on above them. Picture the cooing echo filling one of those chambers, hundreds of birds shifting on their perches in the dark, tended by someone whose entire job was making sure the town's secret meat supply kept multiplying, while soldiers outside the walls waited for hunger to do their work for them. Think about what it meant to hold that kind of resource in reserve. A city under siege in this period usually lived or died by how long its stored grain and salted meat could stretch, and every day added to a siege was another day closer to surrender through hunger rather than defeat in battle. Most defenders could only ration what they already had and hope reinforcements arrived first. Orvieto quietly solved that problem in a different way, breeding its own food supply in total darkness, underneath the very streets the enemy above was trying to starve into submission. It is one thing to store food behind a locked door and wait for it to run out. It is another thing entirely to build a living, self-renewing farm that keeps making more of itself, hidden somewhere no enemy commander would ever think to look, let alone find a way to reach. For centuries afterward, the entire system was simply forgotten. Doors were sealed, memories faded across generations, and eventually the whole network was buried and closed off by time itself, until nobody living above it had any idea what lay beneath their own floors, their own kitchens, their own bedrooms. Families raised children directly above ancient oil presses and pigeon farms without the faintest suspicion, the ground beneath their daily lives holding a second, forgotten town nobody alive had ever seen. It resurfaced only in the 1970s, when a landslide tore open the hillside and exposed the mouth of the caves for the first time in generations, dragging the whole hidden world back into daylight almost by accident, as though the hill itself had finally decided to stop keeping the secret. The detail that stays afterward is that hidden farm, hundreds of nesting holes carved patiently into solid rock, so a city could outsurvive an entire army with nothing but birds nobody outside could ever touch or count. And the whole hollow world beneath Orvieto sat waiting in silence for longer than anyone could have guessed, until the earth itself, quite by accident, finally decided to give up the secret. The next place on this list also served as a wine cellar and a prison at once, and according to legend, it once held the real-life inspiration for Dracula behind its locked doors. Number 3. Buda Castle Labyrinth. Orvieto had hidden its wells and kilns for the sake of storage and survival. Beneath Castle Hill in Buda, in what is now Budapest, Hungary, the passages were never dug for storage alone. They were carved by nature first, and only later claimed by kings, and that single difference sets this labyrinth apart from almost everything else on this list. Nobody set out to build it from scratch. The earth had already done the work long before any mason arrived, and people simply moved into what was already there. Almost every other underground refuge on this list demanded generations of grinding labor before anyone could shelter inside it. Here, nature had already spent thousands of years excavating an entire hillside, and all that medieval Hungary needed to add was a reason to use it. The caves under Castle Hill are natural in origin, hollowed out over thousands of years by warm mineral springs that still run somewhere in the rock beneath the modern city. Long before there was a fortified hilltop to speak of, water had been quietly dissolving the limestone, opening chambers and connecting corridors that no builder ever needed to chisel by hand. Walking into those older chambers even now means stepping into air that stays noticeably cooler than the street above, a kind of natural refrigeration that no medieval engineer had to invent, only notice and put to use. Then came a catastrophe that reshaped the whole region. After the Mongol invasion tore through the area in the 13th century, leaving towns burned and populations scattered, the Hungarian King Bela IV drew the obvious lesson from the ruins. Open ground and wooden walls had offered no real protection at all, so stone and high ground became the only defense worth trusting. He raised Buda Castle directly above these hollow caves, and the medieval city that grew up around it never stopped using what lay beneath its own streets, almost as if the castle above ground was only the visible half of a much larger settlement. The full network runs more than 1,200 meters, sitting roughly 16 meters under the historic district of Castle Hill, deep enough that the temperature below barely shifts no matter what the season is doing above. That kind of steady cool and damp happened to be exactly what medieval Buda needed, because the city built much of its economy on wine. In the enormous cellars cut straight into the bedrock, barrels sat stacked in long rows beside food that needed the cold simply to last through winter, an entire underground pantry quietly feeding a hilltop capital that had nowhere else to keep anything fresh. A modern building would need mechanical refrigeration to hold barrels at a steady chill through an entire summer. Medieval Buda needed none of that. The hill itself was already doing the job silently, long before anyone thought to call it infrastructure. Over the years, the same tunnels took on a second, far harsher purpose. Stretches of the labyrinth became a prison, sealed away from daylight and from sound, where a person could be held for as long as someone above decided, without the rest of the city needing to know exactly where. There would have been no dawn to mark a new day down there, only the sound of boots crossing the floor overhead and a guess at how much time had passed since the last meal arrived. Centuries later, in a very different kind of war, the tunnels were pressed into service once again, this time as an air raid shelter, sheltering ordinary residents through two separate conflicts, while the streets directly above their heads were being bombed. For families crouched down there while the city was rearranged block by block from the sky, the same cool stone that had once held wine barrels and prisoners was now the only fixed, unchanging thing left in their world. According to legend, it was somewhere in these very cellars that Vlad III, known today as Vlad the Impaler, the historical figure behind the legend of Dracula, was held prisoner in the middle of the 1400s on the orders of King Matthias. Picture what that would actually have meant in practice. A ruler whose name alone was said to terrify entire invading armies, a man remembered across the region for impalement and cruelty on a scale rulers rarely admitted to in their own records, reduced to sitting somewhere in the dark beneath someone else's stone floor, listening to footsteps overhead and waiting on a decision that was not his to make. Historians still debate whether he was truly kept in this exact stretch of tunnel or somewhere nearby within the same hillside complex, but the story has never once let go of the place, and every guide who leads a tour through the labyrinth today still stops at roughly the same spot to tell it. Was the man held down there truly the feared warlord whose name still unsettles people centuries later? Or has this stretch of tunnel simply absorbed a legend, the way old stone tends to absorb whichever story visitors want to believe? Nobody now living can answer that for certain, and that uncertainty is exactly what keeps the story alive. When the network was properly surveyed again in the 1930s, during a wave of new construction spreading across the city above, workers digging through the old passages found human bones still lying undisturbed in the dark, quiet evidence that these tunnels had been used, and used hard, for purposes no official record ever fully admitted to. The detail that stays is this: the same stretch of tunnel beneath a royal castle spent long years as a wine cellar, then a prison holding the man history remembers as Dracula, and finally a bomb shelter, one hollow space quietly changing its purpose every single time the world above it changed, without a single wall ever needing to move to keep up. Very few places in any city could make that same claim about their own foundations. The next place on this list was never a prison or a cellar built for one castle alone. It was an entire hidden village built for thousands of ordinary people, and it was found again not by archaeologists but by soldiers of the First World War who just wanted somewhere to wait out the shelling, a place called Naours. Number 2. Naours. The village of Naours sits in the Somme, in the region of Picardy in northern France, and beneath it lies a hiding place built for an entire community, not for one castle and its court. That distinction matters, because everything on this list up to this point has really been about protecting the few, the ruling family, the treasury, the the garrison behind its walls. Naours flips the entire premise on its head. What began as ordinary limestone quarries, worked for building stone the way quarries were worked all across the region, was gradually widened over the medieval centuries into a refuge against Norman raiders, the Vikings, and later against the religious wars that tore through the French countryside and turned neighbor against neighbor for generations at a time. Widening a working quarry into a refuge able to hold thousands of people was not the work of one frightened season. It meant generation after generation of villagers quietly chipping away at the same rock long after the original threat had passed, trusting that whatever came next would be just as dangerous as what came before. Walk into the hill today, and the plain quarry walls slowly give way to something closer to a buried town than a simple hiding hole. More than 3 kilometers of tunnels connect over 300 rooms cut by hand, all of it hidden roughly 30 meters beneath a forested plateau that, from above, looks like nothing more than ordinary countryside. Laid out as a map, the network reads less like a hiding hole and more like a small underground town with its own streets, junctions, and neighborhoods, the kind of layout a modern visitor might expect from a shopping arcade or a parking structure, rather than something dug by farmers with hand tools and no engineer in sight. At its height, the underground refuge could hold as many as 3,000 people from the surrounding villages at once, and crucially, it was built to let them actually live there for as long as the danger lasted, not simply crouch in the dark and wait for an attack to pass overhead. Chapels were carved directly into the rock, so families could still pray together underground. Stables held the animals people could not bear to leave behind to raiders. Wells reached down to water so nobody had to risk a trip back to the surface, and ovens baked bread deep under the same trees that gave no hint at all of what lay hidden beneath their roots. For a besieged community, this was not a shelter in the modern sense of the word. It was closer to a second, parallel village, waiting quietly under the first one for exactly the moment it would be needed most. Picture what those weeks underground would actually have sounded and smelled like. Smoke from the bread ovens drifting through corridors cut for people, not for chimneys. Animals shifting in the dark, unsettled by the echo of their own hooves off stone. Children born within sight of a chapel carved into raw rock, elderly villagers who had never expected to spend their final years underground doing exactly that, and everyone else caught somewhere between the two, listening for whatever sound from the surface would tell them it was finally safe to climb back into daylight. Then, for centuries, the place was simply forgotten, the way so much of what people build underground eventually is once the original danger fades from memory and the generation that dug it dies out. Whatever fear had driven villagers to carve chapels and stables out of solid rock stopped being urgent, then stopped being remembered at all, and the tunnels sat sealed under the plateau in total silence. It is worth pausing on how a hiding place built to survive centuries of raids could vanish so completely from local memory that later generations forgot it was even there, until nothing remained on the surface to hint at 300 rooms sitting quietly underneath. The refuge came back into use in an entirely different kind of war. During the First World War, Allied soldiers stationed nearby stumbled onto the old tunnels and, in the strange lull between battles, turned them into an underground tourist attraction of their own, walking the same medieval passages that farmers had once carved to hide their own families from Viking raids centuries earlier. They left their mark everywhere they went. More than 2,000 names, dates, and signatures from those soldiers are still carved into the walls today, layered directly over stonework that was never built with any of them in mind. One generation of frightened people leaving their names on top of another, centuries apart in everything except the fear that brought them underground. Soldiers waiting out an artillery barrage and villagers waiting out a Viking raid were, in the end, doing exactly the same thing in exactly the same tunnels, separated only by the uniform they happened to be wearing when they climbed down into the dark. The detail that stays is this: a refuge built for 3,000 medieval villagers, complete with its own bakeries and its own chapels, sat forgotten under a quiet forest for hundreds of years, until it was rediscovered by soldiers who used it as a sightseeing stop between battles, leaving over 2,000 of their own signatures scratched into walls that had been razed centuries earlier, for the sole purpose of keeping people exactly like them out. It raises an odd question that never quite gets asked out loud. Did any of those soldiers, tracing their own name into stone next to 100 others, ever stop to wonder whether some frightened villager centuries before them had done the exact same thing in the exact same corridor, for the exact same reason, only to be forgotten completely? The last place on this list was never hidden at all. It stood in plain sight under the streets of an ordinary English city, and the people there did not hide. They simply lived because, for a very long time, they genuinely had nowhere else to go. Number 1. City of Caves. Nottingham, England, is built on soft sandstone, soft enough to dig with nothing more than simple hand tools. And for well over 1,000 years, people did exactly that, generation after generation, without ever really stopping for long. The caves beneath the city are not natural formations left behind by water or time. Every single one of them was carved by human hands, starting as far back as the Saxon period, long before anyone thought of Nottingham as a proper medieval town at all, and the digging never really stopped through the whole of the Middle Ages and long after them. Sandstone this soft can be cut with little more than a pick and patience, which is exactly why the city never really finished digging itself out from under its own streets. Every generation that needed a cellar, a workshop, or simply another room found it easier to carve one more chamber out of the hill than to build anything new on top of it. Beneath the streets of modern Nottingham lies the largest network of man-made caves anywhere in Britain, more than 800 of them threaded through the rock in a maze that most people walking overhead never think about at all as they go about their day. The Old Welsh name recorded for the city by the medieval writer Asser, Tiguacabog, translates roughly to House of Caves, suggesting Nottingham was already known for what lay underneath it back in Saxon times, long before any medieval stone was ever laid on top of the hill. The name came first. The city built on top of it only caught up later. It is a strange thing for a place name to outlive the very reason it was given, and even stranger for that name to still be describing the same physical reality centuries afterward, as though the ground itself had simply refused to let the label go out of date. Starting in the 13th century, the caves were used continuously as beer cellars for the tavern standing above them, keeping barrels cool in a climate that never needed ice to do the same job. The city also holds the only known underground tannery anywhere in Britain, a trade that needed exactly the kind of cool, damp, smell-contained space that no ordinary house above ground could ever offer. Beyond that, the caves served as workshops for craftsmen who needed steady temperatures year-round, and for a great many people who simply had no better option, as actual homes. Where a modern tannery would rely on ventilation systems and chemical controls to manage the smell and the damp, Nottingham simply had the hillside do that work automatically, the same way it kept the beer cellars cool, without anyone burning fuel to make it happen. That last use is the part that lingers longest. Right up until the year 1845, when a law was finally passed banning landlords from renting out cellars and caves as housing, poor families in Nottingham were still living underground, packed into overcrowded, unsanitary rooms carved from the very same rock their medieval ancestors had dug out centuries earlier. Whole households cooked, slept, and raised children in a handful of damp chambers scraped straight from the sandstone, straw laid underfoot for warmth, with only a narrow shaft cut somewhere above to let out smoke, and let in a little air. There was no window to speak of, no real way to tell morning from evening, except by climbing back up into the city above. Damp crept along every wall regardless of the season, and illness spread easily through families packed together in rooms with nowhere for bad air to go. This was not some distant ruin being rediscovered by later generations. It was ordinary people living an ordinary Nottingham life, only underground, within walking distance of neighbors who slept above ground in proper houses and rarely gave the arrangement a second thought. Only an act of law finally ended it, not fire, not collapse, not the caves simply running out of room to hold anyone else. And when the Second World War arrived, less than 100 years later, the very same caves were pressed back into service one more time, now as air raid shelters for a city above ground that was once again being bombed from the sky. The same rocks sheltering the same kind of families for reasons that kept changing shape without ever really going away for good. There is something almost unsettling about a single hillside doing this much work across so many centuries. Cellar, tannery, workshop, slum housing, bomb shelter, never once running out of new reasons to be needed by the very same city sitting on top of it. The detail that stays is simple. A Welsh name meaning House of Caves was already true in the age of the Saxons, and it was still true nearly 1,000 years later, when the poorest families of Nottingham were only pulled out of those same medieval caves by an Act of Parliament in 1845, a name given to a hillside before England existed in any form anyone today would recognize turned out to describe the place with total accuracy for almost the entire span of recorded history that followed it. How many other names from that era have survived at all, let alone stayed this precisely true to the ground they describe, long after everyone who first spoke them was gone? 10 underground worlds spread across 1,000 years and half a continent, and every single one of them was built for the same reason, because somewhere above ground, something had made it too dangerous, too crowded, or too desperate to keep on living in the light. Some of these places held out for a few desperate weeks at most. Others quietly kept generations of ordinary families for centuries, long after anyone left above ground still remembered why the digging had ever started in the first place. 10 very different landscapes, 10 very different fears, and yet somehow, underground, all of them ended up looking remarkably like the same story told over and over again. Derinkuyu was buried, Kaymakli was layered, Ozkonak was armed, Vardzia was exposed, Uplistsikhe was abandoned, Chufut Kale was emptied, Orvieto was fed, Buda Castle Labyrinth was legendary, Naours was reclaimed, City of Caves was inhabited. 10 different names, 10 different centuries, and 10 different reasons to stop living on the surface of the earth. Look past the details, though, and the same handful of fears keep repeating themselves underground, over and over, across cultures that never spoke to each other, and centuries that never overlapped at all. People dug down to escape an army they could not beat in the open field. They dug down to survive a siege that starved them out above ground, one empty granary at a time. They dug down because the law of the land had already failed them, or because there was simply no house left standing that was not carved from solid rock. Some of these places sheltered a whole town for a matter of desperate weeks. Others quietly held generations of ordinary families for centuries, long after the danger that first sent people underground had been forgotten by everyone still living above them. Every one of these places is really an answer to the same quiet question. What do you do once the surface of the earth stops being safe enough to stand on? The answer, again and again, across 1,000 years and half a continent, was to go down and keep going, and in some cases, simply stay there for good, raising children who never knew any other kind of ceiling. If you have made it this far, through 9 different centuries and one very stubborn wine cellar underneath a castle in Budapest, you are clearly someone who actually finishes what they start watching, which is exactly the kind of viewer this channel is made for. We keep pulling up stories buried this deep precisely because people like you stick around for every last one of them. So if any part of this got under your skin even a little, subscribing costs nothing at all, and it tells us to keep digging in places most channels never bother to look twice. Before you go, pick one of these 10 hidden cities, the one you think you could have actually survived in, or the one you would never set foot in even with an army waiting at the gates above you, and make your case in the comments. Tell us which underground world you would have chosen, and why that one and not another. We will be reading every single one of them.